started. Thank you all for coming tonight to this celebration in honor of Ugo Rondinone, the son published by Rizzoli Bookstore. Ugo Rondinone is a Swiss-born artist who lives and works in New York. He's been the subject of recent exhibitions at dozens of institutions around the world, and his sun paintings are among his most celebrated series, represented here in unprecedented scale. And tonight we'll be in conversation with Bob Nickas, a writer and curator based in New York. He has organized over 120 exhibitions since 1984. He's the author of Painting Abstraction, among other books. And their conversation will be moderated by Lauren Olson, an editor at Rizzoli, who specializes in fashion, art, and design. Her writing appears in Text der Kunst, and her titles include Feelings, Soft Art, Alex Katz, and Rose Smith, among many others. So after the conversation, we will have time for an audience Q&A, and then we invite you to please join us afterward for a book signing. We will have books available for purchase here in the salon tonight. Please find me if you'd like to purchase a book and have it signed. And I think that's all. Yeah, please just keep your masks on for the event tonight, and I think that covers it. So without further ado, please let me turn things over to Ugo, Bob, and Lauren. Please welcome them.
Thank you, Christine. So it's probably too close. Okay, here we go. A project this massive is impossible without a lot of help. I'd like to thank everyone on Ugo's team, particularly Matthias and Francisco, they're here, our designer Sarko, our publisher Charles Myers, and our associate publisher Margaret Chase, for having faith in this project. The galleries, all 5 or 6 of them, for making this possible and for being supportive. Special appreciation and thanks to Barbara Sadek, our peerless production expert in the audience with you tonight. This project is her baby as much as it is ours. And of course, we'd love to thank our printer CNC for working with us on this extraordinary project. When I approached Ugo with this about 2 years ago, yeah, I think it was about 2 years ago, feels longer. We wanted to make something completely different from what Rizzoli has made before. Art books, come in different sizes. Of course, an oversized art book at this point in time would be something that's maybe like 10 by 12 inches, 10 by 14 inches, maybe even 15 inches. But this book is unusually large, as you can see, at 19 by 22 inches and weighing in at over 20 pounds. We knew that the perfect partner for a project this ambitious would be Ugo, an artist known for his monumental vision, both in size, famously with his 7 Magic Mountains series and other monumental outdoor works, and in duration, with series spanning over 30 years. Ugo's large sun works are, I think, mostly 220 centimeters. So that's set over 7 feet. So even reproduced on the page at 19 by 22 inches, as you can see in front of us. I don't know if the screen's still going, but so that's say 7 feet versus on the page at 19 by 22 inches. It's of course smaller, but not the same reduction that you would normally have when reproducing plates for an art book. So why is this different? Essentially, when you see one of Ugo's sun works exhibited in let's say like you're at one of his shows or you're at a gallery or museum, they have this hazy effect between the different bands, which drives you to walk further or closer to the work to try to resolve the color bands. We tried to make it so the viewing distance, when you're looking at the page, the open pages in front of you, is similar to that experience. So while the scale is different, the optical effect might be somewhat similar. This is sort of a different effect than what you would normally get from an art book. So again, the goal, and hopefully if any of you get this book or get the chance to look through it, is to have the color expand beyond the end of your field of vision, so it starts to blur out on the outside. The size of the book, of course, is only limited by the size of an offset printing press. We've really maxed out what we can do. At 19 by 22 inches, this is called an elephant folio, which is a size that isn't really produced anymore. From special paper to special hinges to packaging to shipping, we had to do everything differently to accommodate the scale and weight. Again, we were very lucky to work with a great team for the months and years, for the patience to work through all of these details. Again, we normally see Ugo's sons in groupings in exhibitions. Sometimes they're presented as individual series of work, like Moonlight, Sometimes they're presented with other sun pieces, but this is the first time I'm aware of that all of them are presented together in strictly chronological order, including the watercolors on which the series is based. Seeing them this way gives us a different sense of the series over time, and to me sort of makes it like a book of hours, which allows us to meditate not just on the day that Ugo made the piece, each piece famously being named after the day it was created, but also the day that we're seeing the individual piece. I imagine that you might flip to one page in the book a day and leave it open. We're incredibly lucky not just to have the artist here with us, but also Bob Nickas. His essay guides us through the series and gives us context on Ugo's practice and on this series in particular. Now at some point, there's going to be images on the screen behind us. Those are going to be from the interior of the book and also from the essay. So you're going to be seeing some works on the screen that aren't from Ugo or from other series that he's made, just for context. Okay, so I think we can go into asking some questions, unless, did you want to do an opening statement? Bob? No opening statements for Bob. Okay, so then we're going to start with Ugo. Ugo, can you tell us what was going on in your life when you started the Sun series?
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ugo. I've been introduced. Hello, thank you. I started the first sun painting when I was still a student in Vienna in 1990. That's 31 years ago. And it was a reaction to a group of paintings that I started a year before, the ink landscapes, and they couldn't be further apart, those two groups. So the landscapes were initiated, or they were inspired by 18th century landscape vedutas, and the sun paintings were like a pictogram of a modernistic painting that we had since Kandinsky through Van Gogh. So the landscape would represent the past in a nostalgic view, and the sun paintings were a positive note into the future.
Can you tell anyone who's not familiar a little bit about the watercolor aspect before you get to the canvas works?
So in both cases, as the landscape and the sun painting, I would do preparatory drawings or watercolors. They were small sizes, just book sizes. The landscape I would make directly in the woods and then project them and scale them up and make them out of ink with little pencil. And the sun paintings I started in the same way, something that I don't have to think about, just doing it. And I came up with the automatic watercolors. They were freestyle, and I would select out of those watercolors those who would be large and executed in a very mechanical way. They are all done in airbrush, so there is no sign of hands, while the landscape are full of them. So I just wanted to give myself a wide ground and to grow the work. This was the two parameters, the landscape and the sun paintings, that would give me the freedom to let this work grow, whatever came after. Don't know if I answered your question,
I think so.
but the important thing was the activity was something that I didn't have to think about, just doing it. So there was an intuitive force by choosing the colors with the sun paintings, and for the landscape, it was really the landscape that I had in front of me, and it was important that I would train myself to get an accurate style of this 18th century veduta.
If I could grab you for a second, so maybe we could go from there to talk a little bit about how both of the landscape series and the sun series both are or different ways of dealing with nature, or pick up on the tradition of artists going into nature to work.
Well, one of the things I wrote about after speaking to Ugo, and I think it's interesting when you look at art, I mean, most people who look at art don't know the artist, they don't have that proximity, you don't go to the studio, you don't spend time with them. A lot of times, all you can see is the visual information in front of you. And I would think that with the suns, if they're especially keyed up in color and are really present in that way, especially when the colors are almost psychedelic, that they might seem like they're all about a kind of, you know, wonder and joy and so on. But if we think back to when Ugo made the works, or conceived them rather, it was not an easy time for you, 89, 90. So there's an emotional source for what some people see as these very joyous psychedelic works that's really coming out of loss. I don't know if we really want to go into it, but I do think it's important that you don't see the backstory of an artwork. And of course, art has to put itself forward as a visual experience, but the artist's experience was, in the conceiving of them, was not joyful. And neither was it really escapist, because if you think about the landscapes, those were walks that were made in nature, through the woods, and that's a way of losing yourself and being in your own mind. And when you mentioned that this activity of doing the suns as watercolors before the paintings, I think you told me you thought it was a mindless activity. But it's interesting where you have something like a mindless activity, and your mind is actually really traveling, and you're, so except for the sun paintings where the colors are going to, blacks and grays and purples and so on, more downbeat, the source of the work came from personally a troubled time. And you could say also, when you think about the more keyed up paintings that do seem really joyous, then it's a kind of, then art did what it was supposed to do, which is bring you to another place or save you from that, undertow, just emotionally.
So it was end of the 80s, 89, when I started those two groups, within a year different, and it was in the middle of the AIDS crisis. I lost my first partner, and nature became a side of refuge for me, but also a side of hope, and it had a positive note on it. And I felt I had to leave the studio and just make the most of my life. At that time, as a gay person, you felt at least. And that's where it became the landscape and the sun painting a diaristic note. So you have always a date as a title, and together you would have time and space as an entity that constitutes our life. We have to go back and remember what kind of discussion we had in the end of the 80s, and Romanticism was not one of them. And through grieving, I was looking for an outlet to express my feelings, and somehow the Romantic romantic movement gave me a template with their symbolic signs to include a romantic, or to include or to have an emotion outlet through my art. Back then, as you remember, Bob, the discussion in art was more about consumerism. And what I got out of this discussion was maybe the notion of seducing the viewer, which they clearly want to do the song paintings. They want to lure the viewer into a looking or into a state of look. Yeah.
I mean, that is part of it. It sort of takes me in a couple of different directions. One would be, so, yeah, Bob, you write a little bit in your essay about the mood of art in the late 80s and 90s is maybe something on the both curatorial and making side was a bit cooler, in terms of less room for emotionality, which, or romanticism. Though, of course, by translating it in this sort of minimal palette, it's already sort of moving in a different direction. I wonder if you could tell us, I guess this is sort of going back to nature and also moving forward. Could you take us through either your discussion of Munch or Ankara in relation to this work?
Yeah, I think also when you look at art and you write about art, you're reminded of other things you know, things you've seen, and very often there's someone or something that's really obvious. And so, for example, with the sun paintings, it seems like it's impossible to write about them without mentioning the target paintings of Kenneth Nolan. Everyone does, and even I did, because you have to at least refer to it. So the way I dealt with it was, and it's true, if you have a sun painting hanging there, you have a Kenneth Nolan hanging there, you don't mistake them. I mean, not everyone is an expert, but you don't have to be. You can see they're different in many different ways. But when I bring in, so that's part of why I bring in the unexpected artists. But also I'm thinking more about, picking up from what I was saying before, there's a lot that is in a work of art that's not visible, but it wouldn't exist without it. So for example, you mentioned briefly, each title is a specific day, and you were having this mindless activity of making the watercolors of the suns. And I really thought about Ankara, who made what he did that's most widely known as the date paintings. Each painting is a recording of the date, that day that he made it, and each painting has to be made within the day. You know, he would never start a painting one day and finish it another. They all exist within a 24-hour period. And in a way, I mean, I knew him, and I knew that for him, making a painting, he didn't make one every day. There aren't 365 paintings from each year. Some days he didn't make them, and some days he did. But when he did make a painting, and often they're very small format, so he would be sitting with a table in front of him. It's almost a form of writing. But he didn't say it was a mindless activity, but it was meditative. And I think there's a meditative aspect to your work, which extends to the person standing before it, if they're going to spend some time with it, and maybe get a little bit lost in it, that it's temporal. So that interested me. And also, you know, when I bring in more art historical figures, I think it relates directly to the idea of representing a sun, which Ugo doesn't really do, but he calls them suns. And when you look at, in the history of art, more in the space between abstract and representational work, so I spoke about Munch, who represents the sun as this source of all life. and the Earth circles around the sun, and it represents through many different cultures that life force. And besides Munch, I brought in, because now somehow dealing with representation and abstraction and spirituality and so on, there's a lot of scholarship around Hilma af Klint, and it was probably the most popular exhibition of any museum of any New York museum since, I don't know, the King Tut exhibition or something. But, and also they had more visitors than Warhol retrospective. So I look back in time to this kind of what you call through lines. And I went as far as talking about the representation of the sun in ancient petroglyphs. And, there are these constants that aren't just constants in art, they're really constants in the whole history of human existence. And so even though they're abstract, they're meant to represent. I wrote about mandalas and that as a kind of and tantric art and that as a meditation device. So I think ultimately it doesn't matter if things look alike. There's always a look-alike situation in art, or if they're completely different. Those through lines, I believe, are still there when you think about the artwork as really setting up the possibility for an experiential, an experience. And that's what interests me. I mean, and that's why I wrote about these different. I haven't seen any of them come up, but it's behind me. Have they come up?
Is it side now? Yeah.
Okay, good. So.
Yeah.
So what you see now here, those were among the first one, and they were on a rectangle canvas. And you see how the sun just lifts up above the horizon. And this one came later, maybe 2 years later, in '95, and I wanted just to concentrate on the canvas. I never understood that the connection to the sun was not something that you could easily make, as when in general, it was not just you, it was always, Kenneth Nolan was always the first that people came in mind. And I felt they couldn't be further apart. There was no brush involved, there was an airbrush involved. I did them first by myself, and later I developed that with Pavel. I was living in Bratislava back then, and he was an expert in airbrushing. And so since that day, until 2010, when I stopped making them, Pavel was involved doing them. So I wanted, it was not important to have my hand touch on it. It was just important to have that effect, that tunnel effect that those painting had. As if you would look into the sun, it blinds you. And I felt that what I wanted to achieve. That if you look at that painting, it lures you in and blinds you. And this, what you mentioned about each artist has a certain set of background stories to achieve a certain artwork, but that's just a constant monologue that the artist has with himself, herself, and not necessarily, it doesn't add anything if that information is out. I think, because in the end, what counts is what, if it touches an archetypal button. And that's what I would like to achieve with every work I'm doing, that it touches on a universal language. And the circle is common as a sign of a sun in all culture going back. So I always thought it was obvious, but it isn't. And the second what I wanted to have is really a modernistic sign. So the target per se, if you start adding artist names, you have to make a real research and it would come up, I don't know which 300 artists who use targets, starting from the 20s to the 70s. So to bring out one artist is always diminishing the whole DNA of a circle.
I wanted to mention also something when you bring up this idea of the universal, which was my earlier through line, in terms of projects you've done that maybe people aren't aware of or haven't seen, but there have been in many different parts of the world shows of Ugo's which involve children creating drawings. And many of those projects, the children are making drawings of the sun. And they can all do it. And I think they enjoy doing it. And you must now have thousands upon thousands of drawings by children. And those rooms that are just completely filled with the drawings are usually adjacent to, or at least near, to a gallery with the sun paintings. And of course, there are some relationships because it's a circle, there's color and so on. I wanted to ask you where the idea came from to, in a sense, collaborate with children and bring them into this ongoing project of sun paintings.
So in 2014 I started a serial exhibition that would go to 6 institutions all over the globe, and the base of the exhibition where all my work was the grouping of my rainbow works. So works that have the color spectrum as its base. And in each exhibition I rearranged those different works. What stayed constant was the collaboration with children, where I asked children, the first work was in Rotterdam, where I asked them to make a painting on paper, a sun. This would continue in Moscow and going in Mexico, and what was constant is that there is no difference how a child in Russia to the sun. I have to say those children were between 6 and 12, so in an age group where they are free and having the condition to paint the sun as they teach. And that's the beauty of that project that still goes on. And at some point I'm going to make a book out of it, I hope.
We will.
But the beauty was that this, a child, and that, I'm coming back to the archetype, has an inherent archetype, how a sun should look, or how a tree looks, or how a house looks.
I also wanted to ask, and again, I don't know how familiar people are with Ugo's work, but many of the works exist, or most of the works exist in multiplicity. It's very unusual that you would do one of something or two of something. There's 50, there's 100. In the case of the sun, there's more than 200. And also you're still making them, I understand. Or
No, I stopped them.
you stop? I thought it was going to be throughout your life you would make the suns. Did you change your mind?
I didn't. I changed my mind in that case that I would accumulate too many groups to keep on making. So it was just overwhelming. In the beginning, when I started, I thought I would keep the landscape and the sun paintings as a constant, because they were accompanied by a date. And
Right.
that project makes sense to finish with until the end of my life. But then new groups came, and after the sun paintings, the horizon paintings came, and then the star paintings and the cloud paintings.
Right.
So
that's
it
interesting.
was, what I kept was the date,
Yeah.
the form changed,
Sure.
but the concept of space and time stayed as well. At some point in 2010 I finished those.
Yeah. Just as you say, there are sun paintings, there are rainbow, and you could picture, I don't think we've had an image of it, but a rainbow more or less would be a sun painting kind of split through the middle. Those are also hung very close to the floor, so they almost seem like it's the sun setting or rising. You also have a series where we see, again, what could be a sun rising or setting, but on a horizon line between the sky and the water. So there's suns, there's clouds, there's rainbows, stars, star fields, the landscapes. Have I forgotten? And so, sorry?
The horizon.
Horizons. And so in a way, it makes me think of how artists sometimes, whether consciously or unconsciously, are trying to account for the whole world. This is where we are, and the sun comes up every day, even if we don't see it. On a day that's bright and sunny in New York, it could be, no one sees the sun, let's say, halfway around the world. It's cloudy, it's overcast, it's stormy, it's raining. But the sun comes up every day, somewhere in the world. And so in a way, you're really creating this world that just keeps going on. And if I think about the beginning of the landscapes and the suns in a difficult time in your life, the metaphor is very simple, which is that just the fact of making art and from day to day is, all the works basically say life goes on. And it's part of, I think, what's in general your positive nature. And this idea of circularity, the tide comes in, the tide goes out, night and day. In Ugo's archive, there are many different bodies of work, but there's only two, I believe there's only two larger designations, day and night. Again, referring to nature.
There are all sorts of opposites, because the work builds up on opposites and duality, and resolve the duality out of a reason not to favor anything, just to keep it open. And it's about either looking out to nature or looking into yourself. Those are the two binary forces of the body of work. And a motivation change. So the reason to make them in the end of 80s was different than the last ones that I did in 2010. And that's where language becomes tricky, in the sense where you explain yourself why it happened, because the motive changed. But what stays, it's still the same image, and the way language approaches an explanation is always bound on the given discussion of that artwork, which will change over time, because the focus of language, which is a concept, changes. We explain concept with other concepts. But I believe that art starts there where language can explain anymore. Same way as we listen to concert in music, it's not that our brain starts thinking about what do I listen to. And the same goes with the visual, that what counts foremost is the looking at it. And just to expose yourself to that artwork, it's a part of the understanding of the art.
I have two other things before we open it up to questions. Unless with one question I have about this, so you're saying, you know, art is able to take over where language sort of runs out, right? Something for me that's interesting about this work, the watercolors, totally meditative, personal, private exercise, and then the finished works, 7 feet tall, larger than human scale, overwhelming, and as you said, made by a collaborator who sprays it. To me, that sort of removal between the private process and the thing that's shown, which everyone can sort of identify with or connect to, is this removal, which to me connects with some of the early works in the 80s or 90s when Ugo would have a stand-in for himself in the gallery, like a cast stand-in, and then the clown work. Could you connect at all to the clown work as a way of displaying the sons?
I was really afraid you were going to bring in the clown.
I can relate.
He's gonna
Yeah, I
write
think
it
that's
down.
more for artists. I wrote about them.
He did.
I think it's your question.
Go.
I mean, it was a continuous loop, starting again with the landscape and with the sun paintings. In that display, every window was covered up, so you wouldn't have any connection to the outside world. You were really in that cocoon while you were visiting the exhibition. And the third exhibition after the sun paintings was myself cast in wax and sitting. So it was the artist sitting passively in that exhibition space, and it was a kind of protection, meaning if someone is passive, is just taking it in and he's not for something, he's just there, right? As soon as you do an activity, you're pointing out to something, so you set values. But once you're passive, you're protected of that. You're just innocent sitting there. So the sitting had different connotation for people. They would say, oh, he's sad, or why is he passive? And for me, it was just a form of a meditation, and was the other end of looking out to nature. It was looking out into yourself. And it was also somehow the notion of the artist doing nothing. So not to fulfill the expectation of the public. I have to add, just to explain, so there are watercolors and small landscape drawing that I did myself, and they were never meant to be in the market, and to those days they belong just to me, because back then it was important for me to have a kind of creativity that just belongs to me. They were not shown in public until 2010. We still don't know if it was a mistake, but somehow I felt a pressure as I have been asked, what about these watercolors, do they really exist? Somehow I gave in, and I showed them. But the main point was that at that time, that not everything is for sale. It was a point. But this was a personal point, had nothing, it was not a statement per se, because in the end, seeing those watercolors wouldn't give anything. It would not add to anything in the art world. But those paintings I felt did.
I think also, the watercolors they're intimate, they're small format, they're personal. One of your real strengths is staging different objects in an exhibition. And on a certain level, you mentioned before this idea of seducing. So for example, to walk into a large gallery and have many sun paintings, or in different installations where the windows have been covered over with a colored gel or something, so all of a sudden all the light in the room is tinted. You're really dealing with the overall environment. And I know that when you see a very large sun painting unit, and some of them, depending on the colors, they either seem to project towards you or they go in. But either way, you're drawn towards them. And I remember seeing the show in Paris, I think it was the Moonlight show, and when I first came in the gallery, there were small candle sculptures on the floor. I thought there were paintings on the wall. And when I got closer, I realized they were directly painted on the wall. There's also some paintings that are done as wall paintings. And the fact that they have such a strong presence as an image object, that was kind of the illusion, because even though they were painted directly on the wall, the same thing happened as happens with the paintings, which is they just seem to be hovering in space, and that's I think the greatest quality. They're just hanging somehow in midair.
And in that case, it was a practical decision to make them on the wall because I wanted to maximize the size.
They were huge.
And on the canvas, you're limited
Yeah.
to that size that I chose to bring them through the door without having two parts of it, which would destroy the effect once you have two parts of it, because then you have a line which couldn't work for what they need to be. So it was a practical reason to do that directly on the wall, just to maximize the size. But they have in effect no difference than having the painting on the canvas.
What are the constraints of the sun series? So there's size, there's large suns, there's small suns. Were there any constraints on the colors or on the number of rings? Like rules that you set up for yourself?
No, absolutely no rules at all. It was just pure using as many colors as possible. And they are done intuitively.
I'm asking because the mode of, as you move through the book at the beginning, there's many different color combinations, and then as you move towards the end, it settles into yellows and grays, but that could also have to do with the shows that are being displayed in. I think my last challenge question would be, if in the beginning, people were maybe not so open when the work was being made to any sort of discussion of spirituality or romanticism, do you think that's something that art audiences are more open to now?
Human being is in general romantic, right? Has this idealistic view to the world and to themselves. It was not a discussion in the 80s in romantic. And or maybe Bob knows more about it as an art historian. It was not in my group.
Yeah.
So
Well, people also forget now anyone can do anything, and everyone seems to be interested in everything, although it shifts as it will every 5 years. But there was definitely a time, and maybe it was still ongoing when you were a student, that it was really prohibited to paint. It was not done. So, kind of like a taboo or something. But the sun paintings, I don't think you were showing, oh wait, they didn't exist at the time of, let's say, Neo Geo. So that I think they would have been misunderstood. They would have been, especially in Switzerland, because there was so, that whole tradition of art, graphic design, package design, that kind of abstraction, geometric abstraction. So if they were shown at that time, they'd be misunderstood. They were shown when, what was the first time you showed them?
In 91.
91. So it's already past that time, which was really like mid-80s. And then the landscapes, as remember, because they were, they also weren't really aligning with what was being done at the time. And you did show them close to the time they were made. There wasn't really a delay.
There was just 1 year in between, but then I started them simultaneously.
Sorry?
I started them together.
Yeah.
I just didn't show them together. So I had them in the past.
My point is, there's a lot of art that's of its time. It fits in with what's being done then. You might even say with what's allowed. And most of that art, at a certain point, it really looks dated. That's the danger of art being so much of its time. And sometimes it looks dated within less than 10 years, which happens. But the landscapes somehow, they're kind of in their own space of time, and they never look in or out of fashion. They're kind of you created this your own world, and maybe for some people it looks, it's like a looking back because of what your sources were. But the sun paintings also, I think, never look dated. And maybe they never will. The 2 years that you made paintings before the tondos on the regular canvases, to me, they look like normal paintings. And it was clear that 2 years on, you understood that they really had to be this big circular object. You didn't want to have the edges of a canvas and a picture plane. And so there are other works of yours, I think, that also have this kind of longer life. And we were talking about Himlock Quint, and they're so weird, and they must have, who knows what they looked like to people at the time, or at least when they were initially shown. But they somehow transcend, you know. I don't know how you want to pick up on that, but yeah, the works that when you made them and when you showed them, they didn't really align with what people were doing at that time, and I think that's given them somehow their own space to be.
I mean, the main point for me was really to have two very distinguished group of works, which gave me really the freedom to have the work grow out of this ground. I think it's still important for an artist who starts to give himself as much ground as possible so the work can develop. And since the 80s, you can not judge an artist by one or two groups, as you need to see a bigger picture. What does it look in 20 years to judge an artist's work? That's what you maybe mean by dating works. If something is dated in the sense that it gets caught in one thought, that it may stay dated. But we have many samples of artists who give themselves a freedom, who can wear
you guys have anything else, I think we can open it up to questions. Okay. I don't know if Christine is still here with us. Hello. But if anyone has any questions, I mean, we're a small enough group, you could probably just stand up, or Christine could take the mic to you.
I might have to borrow your room. Raise your hand if you have a question. I can.
No, we've answered all the
Or a
questions.
comment.
We've addressed everything. The series is completely clear.
I like a shy audience.
All right. So we're good? We're all settled? Okay, let's start the signing then.
So we're going to start the signing. It's going to be underneath this table. Please, this is a beautiful, very special edition. If you'd like to purchase it, just sign me. I will help you buy the book, and we can also help you coordinate shipping. Thank you. Have a lovely night.
Can I take a picture of you with your book? Of course. I'm going to send it to everyone. We'll get a good idea. Thanks, Ugo. It looks great. Oh, great.
What I can do is I can write, and that's a particular, I myself, really close to my neighbors. If I were to give a talk about the work, I would just sit down and write. I couldn't just stand up and tell you.
Oh, it's a Swiss. Sure. Oh, you thought you were in Italian? Can
Good art. I'm coming down. See you. Thank you for coming. Oh, yes, great. Good luck.
The book or the sign?
Yeah, she's 67 now. We've done
Oh, the book itself? Yeah,
more than 3,000 copies in her house that are not cataloged. Yeah, her set is their music from like 1976 to about 1980. No. Do you see that?
How are you doing?
When do you think that's?
Your secret safe for the 26 pounds.
By the way, I'm open Friday.
Oh, okay.
You got around.
Okay.
At the Charter Gallery.
Amazing.
I installed it today.
Okay, congratulations.
Awesome.
Yeah, you must feel good though. It's done, right? I'll give you my business card here.
Maybe a little touch up.
Always. I'm Aaron, by the way.
Okay.
I think so too. I've been working for Barber for a very long time. And Ugo too.
Yeah.
One and the same.
Okay.
But nice to meet you finally in person. You know. I'll see you hopefully Friday.
And did Simone left?
She just left. Yeah. I'm sure he is. He's running.
I'll send you the money.
Please do. Thank you so much. What? Oh, of course. Yeah, absolutely. And you get it every.
Oh, this is beautiful.
In terms of like people I draw.